One night, deep in a Southeast Asian forest, a forest ranger stops in his tracks. From the brush ahead comes a low, slow, rolling sound. A sound his instincts immediately assign a single name to: tiger. He sweeps his flashlight, searching the damp ground for large paw prints. Nothing. He holds his breath, waiting for a shape of black and gold to move through the darkness. Nothing appears. There's only the sound, steady, unbroken, deep enough to haunt, coming from somewhere far lower to the ground than any tiger could ever stand. Because whatever is growling in that darkness has no four legs, no stripes. It doesn't even have vocal cords, the one thing any mammal needs to produce a roar. Its name is the king cobra. Now set that image beside a completely different one. Pattaya, Thailand, a makeshift stage in a tourist square. A man named Kum Chaibudi steps out and bows to the crowd. Behind him, dozens of woven baskets line up in rows. He opens the first one. A massive snakehead rises up, flaring into its unmistakable hood shape. The crowd screams not from fear, but delight. The man leans down, and he kisses the snake on the head 19 times. 19 different king cobras, back to back, on one afternoon in the year 2006, setting a world record recognized by Ripley's Believe It or Not. This is the image millions of people across Southeast Asia grew up with. The king cobra, as a human daredevil prop, captured, kept in baskets, forced to perform for a kiss on the head in exchange for a few tourist dollars. A creature domesticated through its own fear. It's also an animal, officially honored as India's national reptile, woven into myth, into religious ritual, into folk tradition across India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar for thousands of years, worshipped during festivals set aside just for snakes. It is at once revered as a god and turned into a street act, two cultural extremes running side by side, both built on a version of the animal already tamed, staged, or deified by human hands. But no ticket, no religious rite, no viral video has ever mentioned the ranger in that dark forest, the one who froze, certain he'd just heard a tiger. So the question isn't, how dangerous is this snake? The question is, what did a reptile's body have to become to produce a sound that human beings, the top of the food chain, would mistake for the roar of an entirely different apex predator? Its scientific name is Ophiophagus hanna. Ophiophagus in ancient Greek, the word means exactly one thing: snake eater. This isn't a poetic title for prestige. It's a literal description of its daily diet. While most other venomous snakes in the region, vipers, kraits, even its own kind, rely mainly on rodents, frogs, or birds, the king cobra is nearly completely specialized in hunting other snakes, including venomous species, just as deadly as itself. That creates a far harsher survival equation. Its prey doesn't sit still, isn't easy to find, and is sometimes just as lethal as it is. A creature forced to become the hunter of hunters. To sustain a body nearly 20 feet long that can weigh over 20 pounds, the king cobra needs an unusually large territory compared to other snakes. Satellite tracking studies have recorded adults ranging across several square kilometers of forest just to maintain a sufficient supply of snake prey. It also needs stable humidity, dense vegetation near water sources, and most importantly, a forest ecosystem intact enough to sustain an entire food chain made of other snakes. Specializing in hunting other snakes also forced it to develop prey tracking tools most of its relatives never needed. Most snakes rely almost entirely on their forked tongue to smell chemicals in the air, but the king cobra carries an additional advantage, rare in the snake world: unusually sharp eyesight. It's said to be capable of detecting a moving person from more than 300 feet away, a necessary edge when your prey, other snakes, is also moving, also hiding, and sometimes hunting you right back. It doesn't hunt only on the ground, either. The king cobra is a capable climber, said to spend roughly a quarter of its time in trees, climbing low branches to chase prey that's fled upward, or simply to bask and regulate its body temperature. This is a creature that hunts along both the horizontal and vertical axes of the forest, something most purely ground-dwelling snakes never do. Even becoming a snake specialist isn't something it's born into. Newly hatched, still too small to take on other adult venomous snakes, juveniles start out with a far broader menu: lizards, frogs, smaller and weaker snakes than themselves. Only once its body is long enough, strong enough to overpower nearly every other snake species, sharing its forest, does its menu narrow down to almost one category: other snakes in general. This is a growth process in which specialization isn't an inborn instinct, it's a privilege earned only by individuals that survive long enough to claim it. The shrinking of its range over the past few decades has also forced it to change behavior in ways its ancestors living in continuous, unbroken forest never had to face. There are growing reports of king cobras turning up near the edges of rubber and palm oil plantations or newly built residential areas, not because the species has evolved to adapt to humans, but simply because its old territorial map is now sliced through by roads, fences, and forest fragments too small to support the prey base it needs. This is where the story takes a darker turn. A few decades ago, this species range stretched unbroken from India across Southeast Asia into southern China, an almost continuous band of forest. But genetic studies published between the years 2021 and 2024 uncovered a fact that stunned the scientific community. The name king cobra had long been used to describe at least 4 genetically distinct species, isolated from one another by the very fragmentation of the forest itself: the Western Ghats, mountains in India, islands in the Philippines, and Southeast Asian forest patches cut into scattered islands by agriculture. In other words, humanity never discovered 4 species of king cobra. They had been there for 170 years. Humans only just now gained the tools to recognize that when a forest is fragmented, the populations that were once one are fragmented right along with it to the point of splitting into separate species. And the consequences don't stop at a taxonomy chart. They've already cost lives that never needed to be lost. Antivenom produced from Thai king cobras turned out to be unusually ineffective when used to save bite victims in India, simply because, as it turns out, they were never the same species, even though medicine had assumed otherwise for nearly 2 centuries. Most snakes, when threatened, produce a hiss, a high-frequency sound ranging from roughly 3,000 to 13,000 Hz, with a peak frequency usually around 7,500 Hz. That's the register of a boiling kettle, a burst of steam startling enough to make you jump, but not enough to fool your instincts. The king cobra is different. When it rears up, spreads its hood, and warns you off, the sound it produces has a peak frequency below 2,500 Hz, mostly settling around 600 Hz. That's the register of a large animal's deep roar, closer to the register of a human voice than to the hiss of any other snake on the planet. The mechanism behind this is an anatomical structure almost non-existent in other snakes: tracheal diverticular hollow pouches running along the walls of the windpipe, acting as low-frequency resonating chambers. Air forced through them doesn't just produce a hiss, it's amplified and stretched down into an unusually low register, exactly the way a trombone lengthens its tubing to drop its pitch into a deeper note. In other words, its body built its own biological subwoofer, just to say one single sentence: stay back. And here's a point that needs correcting right away. Despite the name cobra, the king cobra is not, in fact, a true cobra. Real cobras, The genus Naja, like the Indian cobra or the African spitting cobra, have rounder hoods, and some species have even evolved the ability to spray venom directly into an enemy's eyes from a distance. The king cobra belongs to an entirely separate genus, Ophiophagus, with a longer, narrower hood and no spitting ability whatsoever. In terms of actual bloodline, it's genetically closer to Africa's mambas than to the true cobras sitting right next to it in the same performer's basket. This fixed front fang jaw isn't a new design, either. It's the shared architecture of an entire family of venomous snakes, the Elapidae, which includes true cobras, mambas, and sea snakes, a lineage that split off from non-venomous snakes and began refining its venom delivery system tens of millions of years ago, long before anything resembling a human ever existed on Earth. Nature didn't need to reinvent this fixed fang jaw for the king cobra. It just needed to scale up the existing machinery into the largest, longest version in the whole family. When it rears up to warn you off, it can lift a third of its total body length off the ground, with adults averaging 10 to 12 feet in length, its raised body reaching high enough to look a standing adult human straight in the eye. And in that raised position, it can still lunge forward to strike, something almost no other hood-flaring snake can do. Its venom isn't the most potent drop-for-drop compared to other snakes in the region, but because of its enormous body size, a single bite can deliver up to 7 milliliters of venom, enough, according to numerous medical and veterinary sources, to kill a fully grown elephant or cause fatal envenoming in roughly 20 adult humans without prompt anti-venom treatment. There's a small detail in how it actually delivers that venom, one that usually gets overlooked because it sounds less dramatic than the 7 milliliter figure, but is actually far more dangerous than it appears. Unlike vipers, whose relatives carry fangs that fold back into the mouth like a pocket knife blade, only flicking forward to strike, the king cobra belongs to the group of snakes with short, fixed front fangs that cannot fold away. That forces it into a different tactic. Instead of a single stab and release like a viper, it bites down and chews for a split second to work the venom deeper into the tissue, a behavior that means its bite, despite looking less bloody, actually delivers a larger volume of venom into the victim in the same amount of time. And here's another point worth clarifying once more. Despite the name cobra, it doesn't share a taxonomic genus with the true cobras familiar from Asian folklore, the genus Naja, which includes the Indian cobra, the star of flute-charming performances, and the African spitting cobra. Those Naja species have rounder, shorter hoods, and some have evolved the ability to spray venom straight into an enemy's eyes as a ranged weapon. The king cobra can't do that. Its hood is long, narrow, and purely a close-range defensive tool reared up and flared wide to look bigger, never firing anything. Two lineages that look alike enough to share a single name for centuries, yet split onto two separate evolutionary branches long, long ago. July 1st, 2021. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Thiruvananthapuram Zoo, Kerala, India. A man named A. Harshad, 45 years old, steps into the back enclosure, the part the public never sees. He'd worked as a reptile keeper here for nearly 20 years, long enough to know the habits of every individual animal by heart. He'd once been bitten by an anaconda and survived an experience that, according to colleagues who spoke afterward, had left him a little more confident than the job around the most dangerous animals in the enclosure called for. 3 king cobras, named Kartik, Neela, and Naga. There's an unbreakable rule in the trade of caring for large, venomous snakes. Never work alone. There must always be a second person standing by, ready to call for help, ready to lock or unlock the enclosure door in an instant if something goes wrong. But this was the middle of the pandemic. Staffing had been cut in half, and the midday cleaning shift happened to fall in the least staffed hour of the day. Mr. Harshad walked in alone. Security cameras later captured the whole sequence, silent and unremarkable. He moved through his usual routine cleaning, checking, no jerky movements, nothing that could be called provocation. This wasn't an obvious mistake anyone could point a finger at. It was a distance miscalculated by a few inches. in a line of work where the margin for error is close to zero. The animal named Karthik, an individual transferred from another biological park, not yet fully accustomed to its new keeper, read that distance as a direct threat. The strike happened in under a second, so fast the security footage barely caught the motion. Mr. Harshad cried out and pounded on the enclosure door to call for help. But in the very first seconds of the pain, when most people's instinct would be nothing but the urge to flee, he still managed to do one thing. The zoo's own veterinarian later called extraordinary composure. He locked the enclosure door from the inside, keeping the snake contained, blocking its path to an area where visitors were walking not far away. Colleagues rushed in and got him to emergency care immediately. But from the moment the snake's fangs touched his skin, a race against time had already begun inside his body, a race the victim barely felt as the searing pain people imagine. The king cobra's neurotoxin doesn't destroy tissue loudly, the way the necrotizing venom of many vipers does. It works through a quiet, orderly mechanism. Toxin molecules lock onto the receptors that receive nerve signals at the junction between nerve and muscle, the exact point that normally carries the contract command from brain to muscle fiber. Once that receptor is locked, the signal has nowhere left to go. The muscle receives silence instead of an order. The paralysis proceeds in a descending sequence, starting with the smallest, most delicate muscle groups. The eyelids droop first, then the jaw muscles, then the muscles used for swallowing. The victim stays conscious, still hears, still understands exactly what's happening to him, while his body shuts down, function after function, in an orderly fashion. And in the end, the destination of that entire process is always the same muscle group, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, the only muscles responsible for something you never have to think about, breathing in, breathing out. Once that muscle group stops receiving commands, the body remains outwardly intact. No large wound, no heavy bleeding, just the ability to breathe on his own, switched off from the inside while the heart is still beating. Mr. Harshad died at the hospital that same day. The irony is that this process is, in theory, entirely reversible given enough time and the right antivenom. Antivenom doesn't heal a nerve receptor that's already been locked. It works like a neutralizing force, binding to free toxin molecules still circulating in the bloodstream before they can reach any more receptors, buying the body time to clear the rest on its own. But this weapon only works if it's given early enough, in a high enough dose, and just as critically as the correct type of antivenom, produced from the same regional population of king cobras. This is exactly why discovering 4 genetically distinct species, instead of just being an interesting story for taxonomists, becomes a matter of life and death. A dose of antivenom made from Thai cobra venom can turn out to be dangerously ineffective when used to save a victim bitten in India, where an entirely different genetic lineage is at play. This is not an isolated case. Medical data published in 2024 from a case report in the Philippines describes a 46-year-old woman in the mountains of Leyte, bitten on the left thigh near her home, who died within 2.5 hours of the bite, despite being rushed to emergency care right away. The local wound was almost unremarkable. No major swelling, no dramatic necrosis of the kind people picture with snakebite. Precisely because the wound looked minor, many victims and even some frontline medical staff in areas unfamiliar with this species misjudged the urgency. A delay that seems harmless but can cost a life, as every passing minute means paralysis spreading to one more muscle group. And deaths like Mr. Harshad's or the woman's in Leyte aren't isolated accidents scattered among billions of people on the planet. According to the World Health Organization, WHO, roughly 81,000 to 138,000 people worldwide die from snakebite every year, the majority of them in South and Southeast Asia, the exact range where the king cobra lives. That figure is a combined total for all venomous snake species, not this one alone, but it points to something real. While most of the world treats snakebite as a rare, exotic accident worth a headline, for the hundreds of millions of people living beside forests, like the ones this animal calls home, it remains one of the most overlooked causes of death on the WHO's own list of neglected tropical diseases. It's important to be clear about this. and worth repeating once more. There is no evidence that the king cobra actively hunts humans. In both cases above, and in most recorded incidents across Asia, the animal only reacts when a person enters a range it perceives as cornering it inside an enclosure, during close contact care work, or in the wild, when someone accidentally steps on it in the leaf litter. This is not a deliberate manhunter, seeking out humans as prey the way some large carnivores have been known to do. This is a creature whose first choice, almost always, is to retreat, and only when that choice is completely taken away does it deliver its final strike. Precise, silent, with no second warning. Don't go looking for coalition schemes or politics between individuals here, the way you would with chimpanzees or dolphins. King cobras live solitary lives, almost from birth to death. No packs, no social hierarchy, no traitors to take revenge on. But there's one behavior that makes the entire field of herpetology take notice. The king cobra is the only snake species known anywhere in the world to build a nest for its own eggs by hand. No other snake does this. Most species lay their eggs and abandon them immediately, leaving their fate entirely to ambient temperature. But a female king cobra uses her own body to scrape together, gather, and coil forest leaf litter into a nest mound, sometimes rising nearly 2 feet high, built in 2 distinct chambers, a lower chamber to hold the eggs and an upper chamber where she lies as a living roof, standing guard. The decomposing leaf layer inside the nest generates its own heat, functioning almost like a natural incubator, keeping the eggs within a stable temperature range throughout an incubation period that usually lasts 2 to 3 months, regardless of how much the outside air temperature swings between day and night. For that entire stretch of time, she almost never leaves the nest and barely eats, even though her body still requires an enormous amount of energy just to survive. This is the period of her life when she is at her most aggressive, not because of some innate cruelty, but because this is the one and only time in her life she has something to lose in the truest biological sense. The next generation, developing right beneath her own body. An animal that would otherwise always choose retreat no longer has that option during this stage. Its one natural enemy bold enough to challenge it even now is the mongoose, a small creature carrying a mutation in the very neural receptor the venom targets, which keeps the toxin from fitting into place to lock the signal the way it does in most other animals. In other words, the biological lock that took millions of years to evolve to open every neural door is rendered useless against a creature that managed to reshape the lock itself. A clash between these two species isn't exaggerated folklore. It's one of the rare examples in nature where a creature dozens of times smaller still has a fighting chance against one of Asia's deadliest biological weapons, thanks to an evolutionary arms race waged silently at the molecular level. But resistant doesn't mean invincible. The mongoose doesn't win through strength, it wins through speed and a repeated tactic, circling, provoking, dodging each strike, waiting for the snake to burn through its energy and patience until exactly one opening appears for a finishing bite to the back of the neck. This is a fight won by whichever side controls the pace, not whichever side carries the scarier weapon. An interesting contrast to the image of an unstoppable killing machine that most audiences default to for the world's longest venomous snake. The king cobra's dark intelligence, then, doesn't lie in social scheming. It lies in a kind of instinctive engineering, a creature with no hands, no tools, still capable of producing a complex architectural structure using nothing but its own body to protect the one thing it actually cares about. This is where the real danger begins, not because the animal has become more aggressive, but because its millions of years old warning system is steadily losing its meaning. That deep 600 Hz roar exists for a reason. In an old-growth forest where humans and wildlife have coexisted for generations, that sound used to work. It made an intruder stop and back away. Whether or not they recognized it as a snake, it was an effective stay-back signal, honed over countless generations. But as the forest gets carved apart by roads, farms, and new settlements pushing right up to its edge, More and more people are living, working, and moving through land they never used to have regular contact with wildlife on. They're no longer as familiar with the sounds of the forest as their grandparents' generation was. And researchers have documented a troubling pattern. When a modern person hears the king cobra's deep growl, their instinctive reaction isn't to back away correctly from a snake, it's to panic and search for an entirely different large animal, or freeze in place, unable to identify the source of the sound. In other words, the very biological subwoofer that evolution invested so heavily in to prevent conflict now risks causing it instead, because humans, the one species that once had enough experience to correctly read that signal, are increasingly losing their connection to the forest that produced it. This isn't an abstract phenomenon. As continuous forest gets sliced into small islands by roads and farmland, the safe distance an animal needs to recognize a threat and retreat before a confrontation. A distance that used to be measured across an entire forest can now be measured in just a few yards of someone's backyard, or the edge of a footpath leading to a plantation. Compressed space means both sides, human and animal, have less time to correctly identify each other and react appropriately, before a chance encounter turns into an irreversible incident. And while all this is happening, the very animal producing that roar is also disappearing. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, the king cobra has been listed as vulnerable on the red list since 2010, with populations assessed as continuously declining across its entire range, driven mainly by habitat loss from deforestation, along with poaching for skin, meat, and traditional medicine. The species is also listed under CITES Appendix 2, strictly limiting international trade. The discovery that it's actually 4 separate species, rather than helping matters, has made the conservation picture more complicated and more urgent. The current vulnerable status was assessed back when science still believed this was a single species spread across an entire continent. Now that map has been split into 4, and researchers even suspect there may be a 5th, undescribed lineage somewhere in Indonesia. Each individual population has suddenly become far smaller and more isolated than the old statistics ever showed. That's precisely why the IUCN has planned to reassess the conservation status of each newly split species. Some populations, like the one on the Philippine island of Luzon, are estimated by scientists to be extremely small and vulnerable. A single earthquake or tsunami could wipe out an entire evolutionary lineage, hundreds of thousands of years in the making, in one disaster, just as humanity finally got around to naming it. In Vietnam specifically, the northern king cobra population has been placed on the list of protected species, though pressure from poaching for skin, meat, and traditional medicine continues in many regions. Back to that stage in Pattaya. The man is still bowing, his 19th kiss just finished, the crowd still applauding. But picture a different scene. Not far away, deep in a forest that keeps shrinking, a creature nearly 20 feet long, with no vocal cords, trying to say the one thing it knows how to say by vibrating a structure no other snake on the planet possesses, to produce a register closer to a tiger's roar than to the hiss of its own kind. That isn't a threat. It's the most elaborately engineered warning in the entire snake family. An evolutionary signal meant to avoid bloodshed, not cause it. Here's the paradox. The animal that humans turned into stage entertainment, kissed on the head in exchange for applause, is the very animal carrying the most sophisticated, most carefully evolved communication system, built to say exactly one thing: stay back. And humans, the one species that once had the ability to learn that warning language, are steadily losing that ability, not because they've grown less intelligent, but because they've drifted too far from the forest where that language was born. And even when cornered, even in its own final moment, its instinct still isn't to destroy everything in its path. Mr. Harshad in Kerala fell, but the snake, named Karthik, after that fatal strike, never lunged outward, never struck at anyone else. It simply stayed behind the very door its victim had managed to lock, not out of regret, in the way humans like to project emotions onto animals, but because, for the snake, the threat had already vanished. The moment distance was restored. Its task, by the exact logic of millions of years of evolution, was already complete from the very first second. There's one final truth here, simple enough to be easy to miss, yet the key to the whole story. Everything most frightening about this animal, the towering hood, the abnormally deep growl, the ability to kill an elephant with a single bite, didn't evolve to kill. It evolved to not have to kill. Every one of those anatomical structures represents an enormous investment by nature in avoiding conflict, not seeking it out. A truly bloodthirsty creature doesn't need to warn you first with a roar you can hear from a distance. It only needs to ambush you in silence. The king cobra does the opposite. It screams first, as loudly as it can, hoping it never has to use the weapon, hiding behind that warning. Next time you're standing in a tropical forest and you hear a deep growl coming from somewhere in the brush, don't go looking for the paw prints of a large striped animal. Chances are, whatever is warning you has no legs, no stripes, and it already did everything it could so you'd never have to find it. If this episode changed the way you look at a sound coming out of the forest's darkness, subscribe to the channel. The darkness still has a lot left to say. We've only just begun learning how to listen.